This is a motorcycle with its engine inside the front wheel, 5 cylinders in a star, spinning with the wheel as you ride. No gearbox, no clutch, and no way to sit still at a light without stalling. It looks like a joke welded together in a shed. And in 1924, that joke outran the new machines from BMW to win a German national championship. So how does a motorcycle that can't stop win a championship? And if it was really that good, why did it vanish inside 4 years? Grab a coffee, because this story is absolutely insane. Start with what you'd actually see. Picture a vintage motorcycle up on its stand, and where a normal front hub should be, the whole wheel has 5 little cylinders arranged in a star, poking out between the spokes. Now picture those cylinders spinning. The engine isn't bolted to the frame turning a chain. The engine is the wheel. Fire it up and the whole cluster whirls around like the rotary engine on the front of a World War I fighter plane, because that's almost exactly what it is. And for as long as most of us have been alive, that has been the Megola's whole reputation. A punchline. The banana-shaped bike with the engine and the wheel, good for a quick laugh before you move on to the next oddity. But that reputation does the machine a real disservice, because in its own day, the Megola was no joke at all. It was respected, it was expensive, and in the very first season of Germany's National Motorcycle Championship, the series that grew into the championship the Germans still run today, a Megola was a race winner. So before we laugh at it, it's worth hearing the actual story. And the actual story starts in the rubble of a defeated country. Right after World War I, Germany's aircraft industry has just been shut down under the Treaty of Versailles. A generation of German engineers who spent the war building spinning aero engines suddenly aren't allowed to build aircraft at all, and they're sitting there with a head full of aviation knowledge and nothing to point it at. Some of them go into cars, some go into engines for boats and trucks. And a few of them start looking at the motorcycle, which in the early 1920s is still a rough, unreliable, half-formed idea, and they start thinking they can do better. Remember what a motorcycle even is in 1921. It's often little more than a bicycle frame with a small engine bolted on, shaking itself half to pieces, with a leather drive belt that slips in the rain and a top speed a modern moped would be embarrassed by. Nobody has really decided yet what a motorcycle is supposed to look like or how it's supposed to work. That's the strange, wide-open moment the Megola is born into, a moment where a spinning aircraft engine in the front wheel doesn't actually sound much more ridiculous than half the other contraptions people are bolting together. One of them is a self-taught engineer named Fritz Cockerell, and he has a very strange idea. Cockerell is a serious talent, the kind of restless designer who works on cars, aircraft engines, and just about anything with moving parts. In fact, one of his earlier stops had been a Munich firm called Rapp Motorenwerke, the company that a few years later would be reorganized and renamed BMW. He worked there as a test engineer. Hold on to that little detail because it's going to matter. Cockerell takes the spinning rotary engine off the plane and aims it at a motorcycle. His very first version puts a 3-cylinder engine inside the rear wheel, which, believe it or not, is the more sensible layout. He wasn't quite the first person to dream of a front-wheel drive motorcycle. A British firm called Radco had tried and failed with a prototype back in 1919. But Cockerell's was the first design that actually worked, and by putting the engine right in the driven wheel, he sidestepped the whole awkward problem of sending power to a wheel that also has to steer. Then 2 partners come on board, a man named Hans Meixner and another named Otto Landgraf. The 3 of them take the first couple of letters of each of their surnames, Meixner, Cockerell, and Landgraf, and stitch them into one word, Megola. Cockerell had actually been born Friedrich Cockerell and used both spellings over the years, which is why the middle of the word comes from the Cockerell version, the G and the O. They set up in Munich in 1921, and somewhere in that process, the engine grows from 3 cylinders to 5 and moves from the back wheel to the front. Cockerell is convinced this is the way forward. He genuinely believes the spinning wheel engine is the future of motorcycling, and that's where the real madness begins. So let's open up that front wheel and see what's actually going on, because the more you understand it, the stranger it gets. Those 5 air-cooled cylinders add up to 640 cubic centimeters, and they sit in a star shape right out in the open air. In a normal engine, the cylinders stay bolted in place and the crankshaft spins inside them. On the Megola, it works the other way around. The crankshaft is fixed solidly to the front fork and never turns at all. Instead, the entire cluster of 5 cylinders spins around it, whirling away inside the front wheel as the bike rolls down the road. A set of reduction gears connects that spinning engine to the wheel, stepping the motion down so the whole cluster of cylinders whirls around roughly 6 times for every single turn of the wheel. There is no clutch to pull in, no gearbox to shift, no neutral to select. The engine has exactly 1 gear, and that gear is the wheel itself. The touring version made about 14 horsepower, which doesn't sound like much, but the engine was so flexible and torquey that 1 gear was genuinely enough to pull away from a standstill and run all the way up to its top speed. And it's worth pausing on the sheer physical strangeness of that setup. On your bike or in your car, the engine is a heavy lump that sits still in the middle of the machine. On the Megola, that heavy lump is out at the very front, spinning, and it's part of the same wheel you steer with. All of that weight hanging off the front is what engineers call unsprung weight, and the Megola had an enormous amount of it, which is a big part of why the thing was such a handful to keep pointed where you actually wanted to go. Why put it in the front, of all places? Cockerell's answer was pure aircraft thinking. An air-cooled Rotary wants as much clean, fast-moving air over it as possible, and the front of the machine is where the air hits hardest, exactly like the nose of a plane. There was even a strange kind of practicality to it. The cylinders were designed so you could take them apart for service without having to unlace the whole wheel first. On paper, in Cockerell's head, all of this made beautiful sense. What it actually did, once these bikes were out on the road, was create problems no other motorcycle has ever had, before or since. There was one more genuinely bizarre side effect of all that spinning. A big, heavy engine whirling around at the front of a motorcycle behaves a little like a gyroscope, and a gyroscope really does not like changing the direction it's pointing in. So the very same spinning that drove the bike forward also quietly resisted you every time you tried to steer. Get it up to speed in a straight line though, and that same effect made it feel unusually stable and planted, which is part of why the Megola was so much happier flat out on a fast track than trickling nervously through a town. Because think about what happens the moment you slow down. On any normal motorcycle, you pull in the clutch and the engine sits there idling while you wait. On the Megola, there is nothing to disconnect because the engine is the wheel. When the wheel stops turning, the engine stops running. Dead. And that leads to one detail that sounds completely made up, right up until you read the original owner's manual and find it printed there in black and white. The manual's genuine advice for riding in town was basically, try not to stop. If you rolled up to a junction and had to wait, one suggested move was to keep the bike rolling in slow little circles in the road until your way was clear, rather than actually come to a halt. Because coming to a halt meant the engine died, and restarting it was not a matter of pressing a button. To fire a Megola back into life, you had 2 options, and neither one is dignified. Option 1, you heave the bike up onto a special stand that lifts the front wheel clear off the ground, and then you spin that heavy wheel by hand, like you're winding up an enormous toy, until the engine catches. Option 2, you push the whole machine down the road at a run and jump aboard as it fires, while praying it doesn't suddenly lunge forward faster than you can climb on. Every single set of traffic lights was a small physical workout. Put all of that together and just picture one ordinary morning. You want to ride into town, so you spin the front wheel on its stand, jog along beside the bike, jump on as it fires, wrestle it as it pulls to one side, and roll up to the very first junction, where you now face a genuine dilemma. Stop, kill the engine, and go through the whole pushing and spinning routine again in the middle of traffic. or just keep looping in slow little circles by the curb like you've forgotten where you live until a gap opens up. And remember, this was being sold as a premium, top-of-the-range motorcycle. And things got even livelier once you were actually moving. Because every bit of power went through the front wheel, the Megola had what we'd now call torque steer, that same tug you feel in a really powerful front-wheel drive car. Wind the throttle on hard, and the bike would haul itself hard to one side, so you were literally fighting the steering while you accelerated. Fuel was its own little saga. The main tank was built right into the hollow, pressed steel frame, a frame that was reportedly popular with smugglers because you could hide things inside it. From that tank, the rider had to hand pump petrol up into a smaller tank mounted on the forks, which then trickled down into the engine by gravity. The lubrication system was what's called total loss, which means the oil ran through the spinning engine once and then flung straight back off it, out into the air and all over the rider at up to 6,800 revolutions per minute. Picture that for a second on your morning commute. And the front suspension was a single small leaf spring that had to cope with the enormous weight of an entire engine hanging off the wheel. They were known to snap. Oh, and there was no front brake at all, because there simply wasn't room for one. So the Megola stopped using 2 brakes on the rear wheel and a healthy amount of optimism. If you're enjoying this ride, take a second to hit subscribe, because I dig into strange and brilliant motorcycles like this one every week. Now keep every single one of those problems in your head: the missing clutch, the missing gears, the missing front brake, because somebody looked at this machine and decided to go racing with it, and they won. Megola actually built 2 very different versions of the bike. The touring model was the sensible one, if you can call any of this sensible, with the softer 14 horsepower engine, a semi-enclosed bucket seat you sat down into, and a top speed of around 85 kilometers an hour, a little over 50 miles an hour. Then there was the sport model, stripped down, rigid at the back, a slim bicycle-style saddle, and an engine pushed up to around 25 horsepower. On the right surface, the Sport could reach 140 kilometers an hour, getting on for 90 miles an hour, which in the early 1920s on a motorcycle was seriously, genuinely fast. The obvious problem is that a bike with no gearbox, no clutch, and no front brake is an absolute nightmare on a tight, twisty road course. But on a fast, open circuit, where you mostly just point the thing and hold it flat, those exact same flaws barely mattered. And that is precisely where the Megola went. Fast road races and long-distance speed events, and above all the Avus in Berlin, a course that back then was basically 2 enormous straights, each nearly 10 kilometers long, joined by a big sweeping loop at each end. It was built for one thing only, and that was raw top speed. The Avus was a genuinely wild place to race. On those endless straights, riders wound their machines out to speeds nobody had really tamed yet, then hauled them around the far loop and did it all over again. It rewarded flat-out, sustained speed and a strong nerve, and it played directly into the Megola's strengths while hiding all of its weaknesses. Just a long, high-speed blast, over and over, which turned out to be the one thing a torquey, single-gear, front-wheel drive rocket was strangely brilliant at. A Megola Sport was timed on that track at 142 kilometers an hour, about 88 miles an hour, an astonishing figure for such a machine in the early 1920s. But the Megola's greatest day didn't come on that Berlin speed track. It came on a triangle of ordinary public roads in the hills of Thuringia at a race called the Schleizer Dreieck in June of 1924. The rider was a works racer named Toni Bauhofer. That year, Germany was running its national road racing championship for the very first time, and at Schleiz, Bauhofer and his Megola were flat out the fastest thing there all day, taking the win in the top class, the one for the biggest machines over 500 cubic centimeters. And here's the detail that makes it land. Also out on the road that season were the new racing machines from BMW, the company Cockerell had once worked for back when it was still called RAP. Sit with that for a moment. The firm that would grow into one of the greatest names in all of motorcycling was right there in that first championship, and a hand-built oddity with its engine spinning around inside the front wheel came out on top of the biggest class in the country. BMW clearly took note, because the very next year they hired Bauhofer away to come and race for them. And this really wasn't a one-off fluke. The Megola was a regular, feared entry in German racing right through the mid-1920s. And Bauhofer wasn't the only man winning on one, with riders like Joseph Stelzer and Albin Tomasi campaigning them too. For a few short, strange years, one of the weirdest motorcycles in the world was also one of the quickest. There was one final wrinkle that makes the racing even more insane. Remember, the bike has only one gear ratio, and that ratio is locked in by the size of the wheel the engine is built into. So how do you gear the bike tall for a fast circuit and short for a tight, slow one? You can't, at least not with a lever. Instead, the racing teams carried a whole collection of complete spare front wheels, each one a different diameter, and each one with its own engine already built inside it. One old account from a man who trained in Bauhofer's own workshop describes the race Megola sitting there next to 4 different front wheels, and therefore 4 different engines, ranging from a small diameter wheel for climbing hills up to a big one for the flat-out speeds of the Avis. To change gear on a Megola, you didn't touch a lever, you changed the entire front of the motorcycle. So the Megola worked. It was genuinely fast, it won races at the highest level, and for a few years in the early 1920s, it was a real object of desire, an expensive, exotic, hand-built luxury motorcycle. And that, in the end, is exactly the thing that killed it. Because while Megola was building these beautiful, complicated machines in Munich, the German economy had just been through a catastrophe. In 1923, the country suffered one of the worst bouts of hyperinflation in history, the era of wheelbarrows piled with worthless banknotes, of prices doubling between breakfast and dinner, of people burning cash because it was cheaper than firewood. A new currency finally stopped the freefall, but the damage was done, and the country was left broke. And in a country that broke, almost nobody has money for an exotic, expensive toy with an aircraft engine in its wheel. Demand for expensive motorcycles simply evaporated. A machine like the Megola only makes any sense when there are comfortable, well-off buyers who want something fast and exotic and don't mind the daily hassle. And the wreckage of those years wiped that exact customer off the map. The people who might once have bought a hand-built luxury motorcycle were now worrying about the price of a loaf of bread. Megola tried to survive by pivoting to a cheap, ordinary little 175 cubic centimeter runabout, a plain, sensible bike for people with no money, which is about the least Megola thing you could possibly imagine. It wasn't enough. Production ended in 1925. In total, across fewer than 5 years, only around 2,000 Megolas were ever built. A machine that had just won the top class of the national championship simply ran out of road, off the track. The wild idea hadn't failed against the clock at all. The whole economy around it had collapsed. And with that, the strangest piece of motorcycle engineering of the entire decade quietly disappeared. Today, the Megola has become exactly what it was always destined to be, one of the rarest and most collectible motorcycles on the planet. A handful survive in museums, including the Great Deutsches Museum in Munich, and one was displayed at the Guggenheim in New York in 1998 as part of a famous exhibition on the art of the motorcycle. When a real one changes hands now, it is serious money. A replica fitted with an original engine sold at a Bonham's auction for around £82,000. People are still completely fascinated by it, because there has honestly never been anything else quite like it. Any serious motorcycle museum that can get its hands on a Megola tends to put it right out front, because almost nothing else in the building makes visitors stop dead and ask, wait, what on earth is that thing? A group of engineers even tried back in 1935 to build a sleeker, improved version of the front-wheel drive idea, and the Second World War ended that project before it ever really got going. But the deepest twist in the whole Megola story is what Cockerell himself believed. He was totally convinced that the engine-in-the-wheel Megola was the future of motorcycling. And a few years later, he also designed a water-cooled, inline 4-cylinder motorcycle. And as far as he was concerned, that layout was the dead end, the dull idea that would never really catch on. He had it exactly backwards. The spinning wheel engine became a museum curiosity, a beautiful dead branch on the family tree. and the inline-4 he waved away became the shape of nearly every serious motorcycle that came after, the very layout that 4 Japanese companies would one day ride to, complete and total control of the entire motorcycle world. But that, as they say, is a story for another video. And honestly, it might just be even crazier than this one.